In the 18th century, there were to be found in nearly every European army one or more female soldiers. Those women and girls who enlisted in the British Army were generally wives or sweethearts of soldiers whose regiments had been ordered abroad, and the women, preferring to encounter the dangers and hardships of a foreign campaign rather than the miseries of separation, disguised themselves in male attire and enlisted in some battalion which was embarking for the seat of war. Sometimes women, deserted by their husbands, resolved to follow their unfaithful spouses all over the world and, unable to afford traveling expenses, enlisted at the first recruiting depot and trusted to chance for meeting with or hearing of the object of their search. As no personal examination of recruits took place in those days, either in Great Britain or elsewhere, there was no way of finding out the imposture until afterwards. The most famous woman who ever served surreptitiously as a private in any modern European army was Christian, born Christiana, Davies, alias Mother Ross. She was born in 1667 in Dublin, Ireland, of parents whose probity acquired them that respect from their acquaintance which they had no claim to from their birth. Her father was a brewer, employing upwards of 20 servants exclusive of those engaged on his farm. Christiana never liked sedentary work and in the matter of education never made much progress. She had barely sufficient patience to learn reading and to become a good needlewoman. Open-air exercises were her delight, ploughing, haymaking, and above all riding on horseback.
I used to get astride upon the horses and ride them barebacked about the fields and ditches, by which I once got a terrible fall and spoiled a grey mare given to my brother by our grandfather. Father never discovered the offender, but to purchase the silence of a cowherd who saw me and the mare fall into a dry ditch, I was obliged for a long time to give him a cup of ale every night.
In 1685, when the Irish were arming for King James, Mr. Kavanagh sold his corn and equipped a troop of horse, with which he joined that monarch. After enduring great hardships, he was dangerously wounded at the Battle of Aughrim, June 12, 1691, and died a few days after. His property was confiscated by government. Previous to this, shortly after the departure of Mr. Kavanagh from home, the Roman Catholic inhabitants of Leaslip blocked up the door of the parish church during divine service, with logs of wood, butcher's blocks, and any other heavy articles which came to hand. Christiana was at home when this occurred, but her mother being with others blockaded in the sacred edifice, she seized up a kitchen knife and ran to the rescue. Being resisted by a sergeant, she thrust the knife through his leg. Then, removing the things which blocked up the door, set the congregation free. Christiana was arrested for wounding the sergeant, but was afterwards liberated. After the death of her father, Christian went on a visit to her aunt, the landlady of a public house in Dublin, who, at her death, left the establishment to her niece. Christian married Richard Welsh, a good-looking young fellow who acted as barman and general assistant. After 2 boys had been born, her happiness was suddenly blighted by the mysterious disappearance of Richard, of whom nothing was heard for several months. At last, when she had given him up for dead, a letter arrived telling her how on the day of his disappearance, he had been invited by an old friend on board a transport with recruits on board. The vessel set sail, and they had reached Holland before he could get ashore. Having no way of getting back to Ireland, he enlisted in a foot regiment. Christian resolved to follow her husband to Flanders, letting the public house, leaving her furniture with different friends, and placing one child with her grandmother and the other with a nurse. She dressed herself in a suit of her husband's clothes, cut her hair short, and went to the Golden Last, where Ensign Lawrence told the new recruit that she was a clever, brisk young fellow, and enrolled her under the name of Christopher Welsh in the Marquis de Pizarro's regiment of foot. The recruits were disembarked in Holland. Thence they marched to Gorkum, where they received their uniforms, and the next day they advanced to Landen, which they reached a day or two before the great battle of July 19th, 1693.
Here we were incorporated into our respective battalions. I found the drilling very easy, having been accustomed to soldiers when a girl and delighted with seeing them exercise. I very soon was perfect and applauded by my officers for my dexterity in going through it.
The same night that she arrived at Landen, being on night guard at the door of the Elector of Hanover, afterwards George I, Christian was wounded by a musket ball which grazed her leg, barely missing the bone. She was thus laid up for 2 months. During the summer of 1694, Christian, being out with a foraging party, was made prisoner and brought, together with 60 English and Dutch, to Saint-Germain. When the ex-Queen of England heard that Christian and her companions were English soldiers, she ordered that each man should have a pound of bread, a pint of wine, and 5 farthings each per diem, with clean straw every night. But the Dutch prisoners were not allowed these luxuries. The Duke of Berwick, a Marshal of France, visited the prison and tried to persuade the British to follow his example and enter the service of the Grand Monarch. The chief annoyance which Christian suffered was the fear of being recognized by her cousin, Captain Kavanaugh, a French officer, who visited the prison nearly every day. About 9 days later, the English prisoners were exchanged, and on being set free, they waited upon the Queen to thank her for her kindness. Her regiment passed the winter of 1694 in Gorkum, where Christian passed her time very merrily by courting the young and pretty daughter of a wealthy burgher. After a few weeks' courtship, the poor girl grew absolutely fond of her military wooer. This frolic led to a duel between Private Welsh and a sergeant of the regiment who wished to engage the girl's affections. Having dangerously wounded the sergeant, Christian was ordered under arrest, but her father, who was in ignorance of the real state of the case, exerted his influence with the authorities and procured her discharge from the regiment. Bidding farewell to the girl, under pretense of going to purchase a commission, Christian enlisted in the 6th Dragoons, commanded by Lord John Hayes, and served all through the campaign of 1695, including the Siege of Namur. Nothing remarkable happened to her till the Peace of Ryswick, September 20th, 1697, when she was discharged and went home to Ireland. None of her friends recognized the stalwart dragoon as being identical with Mrs. Welsh, so in place of claiming her property, she found other means of support until the War of the Spanish Succession broke out in 1701. Returning to Holland, Christian re-enlisted in the 6th Dragoons. She served through the campaigns of 1702 under the Duke of Marlborough without being wounded. She was one of the captors of Venlo, September 23rd, 1702, which proved a profitable investment for the English, for they found more than 30 pieces of cannon, 20,000 florins, and a quantity of plate and jewelry. The dragoons wintered at Venlo, and a night or two after their arrival, she was ordered with others to escort the Duke of Marlborough along the banks of the Meuse.
During our march by the darkness of the night, we mistook our way, and going up the country fell in with a pigsty, where was a sow with 5 pigs, one of which I made bold with. I was possessed of it some time, when one tailor, a corporal belonging to Brigadier Panton's regiment of horse, attempted to spoil me of my booty, whereupon some words arising, he drew and made a stroke at my head, which I, warding with my hand, had the sinew of my little finger cut in 2. At the same time, with the butt end of my pistol, I struck out one of his eyes.
After serving all through the campaign of 1703, including the Battle of Ekkeren and the sieges of Bonn and Lemberg, she was wounded in the hip at the Battle of Donauwörth, July 2nd, 1704. The musket ball lodged so firmly in the bone that the efforts of 3 surgeons in the hospital near Schellenberg were insufficient to extract it. Christian, with difficulty, warded off the discovery of her sex. She left hospital just in time to assist in plundering the Bavarians.
We spared nothing, burning or otherwise destroying whatever we could not carry off. The bells of the churches we broke to pieces that we might bring them away with us. I filled 3 bed ticks, after having emptied them of the feathers, with bell metal, men's and women's clothes, some velvet, and about 100 Dutch caps which I had plundered from a shop.
Christian did not expand on what she meant by Dutch caps, which might have been caps for a firearm. On the other hand, the actual cap may have been something quite different. The notorious Casanova notice in his autobiography of stealing a number of Dutch caps from a nun, leaving a poem in exchange. He was referring to condoms. After the Battle of Blenheim, in which she was in the midst of the fight, under the hottest of the fire, Christian was appointed one of the guard dispatched with the prisoners to Breda. Having halted to refresh themselves with a pint of beer and a pennyworth of bread each, Christian saw the long-lost Richard Welsh, now a sergeant in the Earl of Orkney's regiment of foot, wooing a Dutch woman. She abused him heartily at first, but she soon forgave him. It was agreed that she should remain in the army and pass as his brother. On the 23rd of May, 1706 was fought the Great Battle of Ramillies. When the French were retreating, Christian, who had fought valiantly during the engagement, was struck in the head by an unlucky shell fired from a mortar planted on the steeple of the church. Her skull was fractured, and she was carried to the hospital of Meldray, where her head was trepanned. During a 10 weeks illness, the long-dreaded discovery of her sex was made. The surgeons sent word to Brigadier Preston that his pretty Dragoon was a woman. The brigadier, who would at first scarcely believe the news, told Christian that he had always looked upon her as the prettiest fellow and the best man he had. The story soon spread through the regiment, and Christian was visited by Lord John Hayes and all her officers and comrades. Lord John gave strict orders that she should want for nothing, and promised that her pay as a dragoon should be continued till she had quitted the hospital. Of course, she could no longer stay in the regiment.
Brigadier Preston made me a present of a handsome silk gown. Every one of the officers contributed to furnishing me with whatever was requisite for the dress of my sex, and dismissed me the service with a handsome compliment.
Her husband having been questioned relative to their previous acquaintance, it was thought prudent to have them married again, and this second wedding was celebrated with much solemnity in presence of all the officers, who would kiss the bride and bestowed upon her a piece of gold as both a wedding and farewell gift. For a short time she carried on the business of cook to the 6th Dragoons, but finding the work too heavy, she became a sutler, or operator of a mobile store that catered to soldiers. She spent much time in marauding, and one day in 1708, being in male garb, she and her mule were taken prisoner. However, she persuaded the French officer to let her go. Shortly before this, she hired herself as cook to the head sutler of the British Army, Mr. Duper, who afterwards kept a tavern on Fish Street Hill, London. Richard Welsh was slain at the siege of Mons in September 1709. Her grief, she tells us, was something terrible. It was on this occasion that she first came to be styled Mother Ross.
Captain Ross came by, who, seeing my agony, could not forbear sympathising with me and dropped some tears, protesting that the poor woman's grief touched him nearer than the loss of so many brave men. This confession from the captain gave me the nickname of Mother Ross, by which I became better known than by that of my husband.
11 weeks after the death of Welsh, his sorrowing widow was persuaded to bestow her hand on Hugh Jones, grenadier, who was killed at the siege of Saint-Venant, 1710. During this and the following year, Christian held the post of undercook in Lord Stair's kitchen. On the close of the campaign of 1712, she returned to England and called on the Duke of Argyll. He told Christian to draw up a petition to the Queen. Her Majesty received Mother Ross very graciously and gave her an order on the Earl of Oxford for £50, but having waited on the Earl several times and seen neither him nor the money, she petitioned the Queen again. Anne granted a second order for the same sum, payable this time on Sir William Wyndham, and Christian was also put on the pension list for £1 a day. Sir William at once paid the £50, but the Earl of Oxford, without speaking to Queen Anne, cut down the pension to 5p. On the accession of George I, she succeeded in having it raised again to £1, and this pension she retained till her death. Immediately after receiving the money, Christian returned to Dublin, but being unable to recover either her house or furniture, she set up a pub. She was keeping herself very comfortably. "Till my evil genius," she laments, "entangled me in a third marriage." This time the bridegroom was named Davies and belonged to the Welsh Fusiliers. His regiment was ordered soon after the marriage to England. Christian therefore sold her effects and returned to London, where she established a shop in Westminster for the sale of strong liquors and farthing pies. This was in 1715. She prospered so well that after the return of her husband from Preston, she was able to purchase his discharge. But in 2 days after his arrival in London, being drunk, he enlisted in the Guards. During the November of this year, Mother Ross kept a sutler's tent in Hyde Park, where the Life and Foot Guards were encamped. Her husband was a constant source of trouble and vexation. Some friends having obtained his discharge, he spent her money so fast that she was obliged to give up successively public houses at Paddington and in Westminster. She returned to Dublin when the Lord Lieutenant granted her the exclusive privilege of selling beer in Phoenix Park on review days. Tiring of this in less than a year, she returned to England, and after living 3 years in Chester, she entered Chelsea College as a pensioner. She also succeeded in obtaining a post in the college for her husband. Here she resided till her death, being supported by the benevolence of several members of the nobility, principally officers who had known her as Mother Ross. She went to court twice a week to keep herself in the minds of her patrons.
But the expense of coach hire, as both my lameness and age increases, for I cannot walk 10 yards without help, is a terrible tax upon their charity, and at the same time many of my old friends no longer going to court, my former subsistence is greatly diminished from what it was.
For some months previous to her death, Christian Davies's health was undermined by dropsy, scurvy, and other disorders. But the chief cause of her last illness was sitting up several nights by the bedside of her husband. This brought on a severe cold, which threw her into a fever of which she died on July 7, 1739. She was interred with military honours in the burial ground of Chelsea College. Her autobiography, edited by Daniel Defoe, was published in 1740. A second edition came out a year later, with a vignette frontispiece representing Christian Davies in her dragoon's uniform.